On the morning of January 12, 2019, a report came in about the death of 65-year-old Michael Redlick. A well-known figure in certain circles, a former NBA executive with the Memphis Grizzlies and a respected professor at the University of Central Florida, he was initially thought to have died from a heart attack. However, when the ambulance arrived at the scene, it became clear that the cause of Mr. Redlick's death was a stab wound to the chest. Various theories were considered, including self-harm. Later, forensic experts concluded that the incident was a criminal act of taking a life. After some time, the perpetrator was identified. The person who helped Michael meet his fate turned out to be his beloved wife. In June 2022, she stood trial. But this story is not as simple as it seems. The woman did not admit her guilt in the intentional crime and often changed her testimony. The court battles between the prosecution and the defense were long and fierce, and the court's verdict came as a surprise to everyone present. So what really happened in the Florida suburb of Winter Park? Who is the real victim, and could the tragedy have been avoided? Let's figure it out together. In the dock is 46-year-old Danielle Redlich, a short, slender woman. Her chestnut hair has noticeably grayed, either due to the lack of opportunity to visit a hairdresser while being in custody for about 3 years, or because the gray hair is evidence of genuine emotional suffering and stress. Until 2019, she was an ordinary working American, a mother of 2 wonderful children. By profession, she was a multimedia communications specialist and not a widely known person. But after the crime against her own husband, her name made headlines in the media. This always happens when the dirty laundry of a seemingly respectable couple is put on public display. Danielle was born in 1976 in Florida. Soon after, her family moved to Cleveland, Ohio. The girl's childhood was typical in many ways. She grew up kind and well-mannered, with a creative streak. Danielle was the eldest child in the family. Over the years, her attraction to the beautiful only intensified. She first entered Valencia College, where she earned an associate's degree in the arts. Later, she continued her studies in the psychology department of Baldwin Wallace University. In 1996, Danielle's mother, Caitlin Aquina, remarried. However, this marriage lasted only 2 years, after which Caitlin succumbed to cancer. It turned out that the woman had been battling breast cancer for a long time. Thanks to her husband's comprehensive insurance coverage, she received top-notch medical care, which was the main reason for legally formalizing their union. Unfortunately, even high-quality treatment ultimately did not yield the desired results. After becoming a widower, Caitlin's husband not only lost his wife, but also became the sole guardian of her children. Since it was difficult for him to raise them alone, he turned to the deceased's eldest daughter, Danielle, for help. At that time, the 22-year-old girl was already living independently but responded to the call. So, after her mother's passing, Danielle, her brother, sister, and their stepfather, Michael Redlick, found themselves under the same roof. Yes, you heard it right. We're talking about the same Michael who later became Danielle's lawful husband and was brutally abused on a cold winter evening in 2019. For now, the couple's relationship was based on friendship. Danielle took care of the younger children and worked part-time at a bar. Michael was building his career in professional sports, engaged in player recruitment. He genuinely became attached to the children, who became closer to him than his own. He also felt comfortable with Danielle. Over time, she saw in him someone she could rely on. Despite the 20-year age difference, their communication was easy and natural. Gradually, the man and woman began to grow closer. Neither age nor status was an obstacle for them. Although initially, Danielle preferred not to publicize their relationship to her family, so for a while, they dated in secret. Next to his new chosen one, Michael felt younger in soul and body, and she felt loved and protected. Thanks to her husband's good connections, Danielle quickly found a new job at an advertising agency. In addition, he earned a decent income and devoted all his free time to the family. Overall, everything was going great for the couple. Some time passed, and Mr. Redlick received an extremely attractive job offer. He was offered the position of Vice President of Corporate Sales for the Memphis Grizzlies basketball club. But the new job required moving to another state. Without hesitating for a second, Michael suggested that Danielle go with him. However, she had doubts.
The girl didn't want to abruptly change her familiar way of life, and she was still studying. Therefore, she declined the offer. But the long-distance relationship continued, and the couple often met. Once, Michael showed Danielle the house he had purchased for them. This greatly impressed her. The cottage was located in a picturesque area near the Mississippi River, a quiet and cozy neighborhood. Eventually, Danielle did decide to move and start a life together. To dispel his beloved's last doubts, Redlich found her an interesting vacancy in the radio industry. Recalling those times, Danielle said that initially, everything was perfect, and only Michael's work later became a catalyst for change. Many years later, at the trial against her mother, the couple's 15-year-old daughter, Jaden, testified. She described what a wonderful father Michael was and how much he had done for the family. Together with her 8-year-old brother Sawyer, they attended one of the best schools. The children cherished dreams of a sports career, as their father encouraged and supported their endeavors in every way, enrolling them in specialized sections. Jaden felt a strong connection with her dad, which she couldn't say about her mom. In her eyes, Danielle was hysterical, manipulative, and sometimes a toxic person. The young lady sincerely believed that it was her mother who provoked all the domestic quarrels, while her father did everything possible to keep the family together and maintain harmony. But was everything really as the elder daughter saw it? And what actually caused the rift in this seemingly happy and close-knit family? Mr. Redlich's new responsibilities were accompanied by increased stress and responsibility, and relations with his bosses were tense. All of this had a negative impact on Michael. He became nervous and exhausted. To relax and unwind somehow, the man began to seek solace in alcohol. Later, this turned into a daily habit. Michael often stayed out late, coming home drunk and in a bad mood. A gloomy atmosphere prevailed in the house. Danielle tried to be a support for her husband, understanding his difficult state. It seemed that after talking to her, he would calm down a bit and promise to quit drinking. But these promises turned out to be short-lived. Once, Michael ignored a joint dinner they had planned, and this was far from the first time. But that time, the couple had specifically agreed to spend time together. Danielle was extremely upset and said that if he couldn't give her attention, he could have at least warned her so she could plan something else. Heading for the door, the woman made an ill-timed joke, which struck a nerve with Michael. He blocked her path and hit her in the face. The slap was so strong that Danielle staggered, and then she saw that her clothes and the floor were sprayed with blood. Shocked, she recoiled from her husband, who burst into tears and began to apologize. Obviously, Michael sincerely repented and immediately tried to make amends. He took his wife to a familiar sports doctor and told him what had happened. The medic examined the unfortunate victim, provided first aid, and then advised her to see a dentist and a plastic surgeon, as the injuries were quite serious. Danielle even lost a front tooth. The next day, Michael organized an unforgettable dinner and was very attentive and caring. Undoubtedly, his wife forgave him and didn't report the incident anywhere. The state had strict laws regarding domestic violence, but Mrs. Redlich took pity on her husband and decided not to create extra problems for him. In fact, this was not the first alarming sign. Danielle had already encountered similar behavior before. The incident occurred when they were living together in Cleveland. At a concert, Danielle was talking to an ex-boyfriend, which aroused jealousy in Michael. On the way home, he made sarcastic remarks about it. Danielle responded in kind. Suddenly, Michael hit her and then immediately apologized, explaining his action by saying that she had hurt his feelings. Danielle forgave her partner, taking some of the blame herself. Over time, the incident was forgotten. After all sorts of things happen in relationships. The year 2003 was special for the Redlich couple. Their first child, a daughter named Jaden, was born. And just a year later, the couple officially legalized their relationship. It was a bright and carefree period in their lives. Everything seemed to be going great. But despite this, Michael still had to deal with problems at work. There were personnel changes in the company, and he didn't get the promotion he had hoped for. 7 years passed, and the family was joined by another baby, a boy named Sawyer. The parents were fully immersed in raising their children. There was just one unfortunate circumstance: Michael's work. The level of tension was rising, and the man again began to drown his stress in alcohol. Quarrels in the family flared up more and more often. During one of them, Michael grabbed Danielle by the throat and pinned her against the wall.
The woman was horrified by this turn of events. This time, she couldn't endure the brutal treatment. Packing her things and taking the children, Danielle moved in with relatives. By the way, initially, they didn't approve of this marriage, but later came to terms with their daughter's choice. Michael visited her more than once, begging for forgiveness and pleading with her to come back home. After a while, they managed to mend their relationship. But the following years were like a roller coaster. The Redlich family changed their place of residence several times. The head of the family was offered a job in California, where they lived for about 5 years. this period could hardly be called cloudless. The man continued to struggle with his demons and couldn't get rid of the destructive drinking habit. And at one point, both he and Danielle found themselves unemployed and living off their savings. 2014 brought new changes, this time a move to Indiana. Fortunately, the prospects were encouraging. To find a place to live and settle all matters, Michael went there ahead. Danielle stayed in California with the children. They needed time to sell the old house and belongings. The constant moving took a lot of strength and energy. It was not easy for the children to adapt to the new conditions. The whole process dragged on for a whole year. During this time, the family's financial situation improved, but the marital relationship underwent certain changes. The distance and rare meetings did their job. Danielle and Michael grew apart, barely communicating. When the moment of reunion finally came, new challenges arose before them. At some point, Danielle suspected her husband of cheating. Michael became unusually cold and distant, and the former passion faded away. However, he found the strength to admit that the problem lay in his age and health. Previously, Michael was embarrassed to talk about it, fearing that he would lose his young wife. But Danielle appreciated his honesty and continued to support him as before. After trying a number of medications, the couple decided to try a course of hormonal injections. Testosterone injections helped rejuvenate Michael both physically and psychologically. It seemed that he had shed a dozen years, regaining his former energy and zeal. But along with this, his aggressiveness also increased. One evening, when they were watching a movie together, Michael dozed off. Danielle went upstairs to rest. And the next morning, when the woman was brushing her teeth in the bathroom, he burst in and hit her on the head. Michael justified his action by saying that she hadn't woken him up the night before. In response, Danielle stated that she was tired of all this and was leaving. These words only further enraged Michael, and he pounced on her, trying to strangle her. Poor Danielle couldn't even defend herself. She felt herself gradually losing consciousness. At one point, it seemed to her that this was the end. Some time passed, and Mrs. Redlick finally opened her eyes. Her husband was standing over her, frightened, confused, begging for forgiveness. Danielle didn't have the strength for conversation, so she just silently crawled away. After this incident, the couple continued to live under the same roof and raise their children together. But their relationship underwent drastic changes. It seemed they had reached a point of no return. Michael began to drink even more often, and quarrels in the house flared up at every turn, even over trifling reasons. The instances of the man's irritation turning into physical violence became more frequent. But no matter what, Danielle didn't leave him. As much as she was dissatisfied with the situation and resented Michael, her love for him didn't fade. All these upheavals couldn't help but affect Danielle herself. She became nervous, irritable, and withdrew into herself. To somehow abstract herself, the woman immersed herself in photography. And although most of the couple's conflicts didn't go beyond the house, their family still maintained a respectable appearance. Closer to the end of 2014, the Redlicks finally settled in Florida. This time, Michael, tired of constant stress, decided to radically change his career. He got a job as the Director of External Relations and Partnership Programs at the University of Central Florida and began teaching. Although they paid less there than in the NBA, the work brought satisfaction and stability. Initially, the family rented a place to live, but a year later, they purchased their own house in the picturesque Winter Park area. Their new family nest was impressive in its scale, a spacious Mediterranean-style home where Danielle claimed the attic floor. It became a kind of refuge for her, where she often spent nights, especially when Michael was seized by fits of rage. Testosterone injections not only rejuvenated her husband, but also revived the couple's intimate life. But even during intimacy, he could behave roughly. Their relationship remained tense and unstable. Against the backdrop of all these experiences, Danielle found solace in alcohol and gradually became addicted to it. Michael continued to work, providing for the family, while Danielle took care of the children and the household, increasingly closing herself off. Numerous quarrels and feuds eventually led to the couple divorcing in 2016. However, despite everything, the father never stopped seeing his children, financially supporting them and paying the bills. By that time, Danielle had already gotten a job at a school. New acquaintances helped her get out of her depression, and her work duties restored her sense of self-worth. However, she was still continuing to see Michael. He could come and go as he pleased. During one of these visits, an argument flared up again, after which Danielle ended up in the hospital with a head injury. As before, the woman kept silent about the true circumstances of the incident, fearing she might harm her husband. But this time, Michael took her silence for granted. Later, during the interrogation, Danielle said that something unexpected happened in early October 2016. Her husband tried to run her over with a car. Only by jumping into the bushes did the woman save her life. After this incident, she even went to the police station. But when the detectives began to pry into the details, Danielle simply turned around and left. The reason was the same as always. Eventually, the couple managed to reconcile, and they lived together again under the same roof. As it turned out, this decision proved fatal for them. Around 9 a.m. on January 12, 2019, a call came in to 911. At the other end of the line, a woman introduced herself as Danielle Redlich and reported that her husband Michael had just died of a heart attack. When the paramedics arrived on the scene, even before crossing the threshold of the house, they smelled a strong odor of cleaning products, and in the hallway, they came across a bucket of watercolor pink. Further on, a scene worthy of a thriller unfolded before them. In the middle of the living room, in a pool of blood, lay a lifeless body. It became clear that the man had not died of a heart attack, as his wife had claimed, but from a stab wound. The woman who made the call was found with cuts on her wrists. Paramedics provided her with first aid before taking her to the hospital, and the police, meanwhile, began investigating this case. After examining the crime scene, law enforcement had no doubt that Michael Redlich's life had been violently ended. It was unlikely that he had inflicted such a fatal wound on himself. Later, forensic experts confirmed that the blood in the house belonged to the deceased, and the pink liquid in the bucket turned out to be the same blood, only diluted. Apparently, someone, possibly the mistress of the house herself, had tried to destroy the bloody trail that led from the bedroom to the living room, pretending that the body had been dragged. But despite all efforts to clean up, the evidence could not be completely destroyed. There were splatters of blood in the corners of the room and on the walls, and at the entrance to the kitchen lay a large knife, while 3 smaller ones were found in the sink. The detectives were eager to question Danielle, so as soon as the medics certified that her injuries were not life-threatening, the woman was taken in for questioning. During questioning, she repeatedly changed her testimony. At first, she claimed that she thought her husband had died of heart disease. Later, she stated that he had taken his own life after an argument. However, experts refuted her claims. Such a wound is difficult to self-inflict, and people who intend to end their lives usually choose an easier and less painful method. The autopsy showed that Michael died from blood loss. With timely medical attention, his life could have been saved. In addition, his left eye was slashed. Toxicology tests also revealed a high level of alcohol in his system. The investigation showed that a few days before the incident, there had been an argument between the couple, witnessed by their older daughter. Michael had been drinking and barged into the bathroom where Danielle was hiding. However, their daughter Jaden intervened, taking the bottle away from him. After that, Danielle left the house and returned when her husband fell asleep. According to the girl, this was the first time she had seen such an outburst of anger from her father, for which he later apologized repeatedly. She still maintained that he was a loving and caring father, while at the same time insisting that her mother was the instigator of conflicts. The next day, the couple reconciled. Michael invited his wife and children to a football game. However, according to witnesses, Danielle looked upset and hardly spoke. That evening, the parents dropped the kids off at friends for a sleepover and were left alone. Later, Danielle went to McDonald's and returned home around 10:30 p.m. Upon entering the house, she found her husband drunk. During dinner, Danielle received a message from an unknown man. Michael saw this, bit off a piece of his hamburger and spat it at his wife. He then attacked her, trying to strangle her. In self-defense, Danielle grabbed the first thing she could, a knife, and plunged it into his chest. He fell and began bleeding profusely. According to the defendant, she immediately called for emergency help, but mistakenly dialed the wrong number. Her actions were later confirmed during the investigation. In a state of shock, she lay down next to Michael and fell asleep until morning. At least, that's how Danielle explained the 11 hours of inaction. When asked by the prosecution why she had lied during the emergency call and subsequent interrogations, Mrs. Redlich explained that she was afraid. She worried that no one would believe she had acted in self-defense. There were reasons for this fear. Shortly before the incident, she had gotten into an altercation with friends. When the police arrived on the scene, she resisted, attempting to bite one of them. She also refused to cooperate with the investigation, leading to charges of disorderly conduct and resisting arrest. Danielle was on probation for about a year. It was also established that the cuts on her wrists were self-inflicted. She claimed she had attempted suicide due to emotional trauma, but the nature of the injuries suggested otherwise. They were superficial and not life-threatening. Therefore, her claims were not believed. Investigators also found that Danielle was far from a model citizen. Upon learning of Michael's infidelity, she registered on a dating site, where she communicated with men and sought revenge through infidelity. Her profile stated that she was single and not in a relationship. Analysis of countless messages between Michael and Danielle showed that she still loved her husband. When she learned of his infidelities, she felt betrayed and disappointed. She also discovered that Michael planned to leave her, despite appearing remorseful and wanting to restore their relationship. Danielle explained that it was difficult for her to understand and accept her husband's actions. She was heartbroken that she had devoted the best years of her life to someone who did not value her. The prosecution used this information against her. The prosecutor argued that the crime was intentional in a fit of rage, as she could not forgive his infidelity and the impending divorce. Like Mr. Redlich, she was also prone to outbursts of anger, as confirmed by their neighbors, who noted that the couple often loudly argued, escalating into physical altercations. However, Michael and Danielle were described differently by those who knew them. Michael was portrayed positively as kind and caring, while Danielle was considered quarrelsome. Video evidence was presented showing the defendant behaving irrationally and attacking her husband. Michael's friends and brother agreed with this. One of them recalled calling her crazy, but reassured him that everything would be fine as long as the steak knives were hidden away. Danielle's attorney argued that her actions were dictated by self-defense and a history of emotional and physical abuse. Relatives, often witnesses to their fights, confirmed that Michael was abusive and emotionally cruel. They also knew that he frequently physically abused and belittled her, though he never did so in their presence. Some family members reported that Danielle was nervous and hot-tempered, but this only manifested after many years of marriage. The prosecution clung to the fact that she essentially left her husband to die, suggesting she was lying in wait. They argued that on the night of the incident she logged into her dating site account, indicating intent driven by hatred, resentment, and possibly even financial gain. After the divorce, Danielle stood to lose a portion of their accumulated wealth. At the time of Michael's death, her assets were valued at $1.2 million. It was also mentioned that she repeatedly changed her testimony, allegedly attempting to confuse the investigation and may have fabricated evidence. However, the defense insisted that Mr. Redlich was a manipulator and predator. After the death of his first wife, he relentlessly pursued his stepdaughter and molded the young woman into what he wanted. During the investigation, the prosecution offered the defendant a plea deal for involuntary manslaughter that would have resulted in only 10 years in prison. However, she refused, despite facing the possibility of life in prison if convicted of first- or second-degree murder. She continued to insist on her innocence. The outcome of the trial was unexpected for everyone. On July 17, 2022, the jury delivered their verdict. They found Danielle Redlich not guilty of intentional murder, believing her actions were indeed self-defense. However, they found her guilty of tampering with evidence, for which she received a 5-year suspended sentence. Since she had already served 3 years, they were credited to her. On August 5, 2022, the day the sentence was announced, the defendant was released in the courtroom. On October 25, 1976, the Forosov family, headed by Yuri Forosov, a renowned professor of constitutional law at the University of Claremont in sunny California, experienced a defining moment: the birth of their first child, a baby girl named Kristen. As my colleagues recounted, the Forosovs were over the moon with happiness, as the arrival of the little one was a wonderful addition to their successful life. Thanks to their high positions and status in society, they could provide their children with everything necessary for a comfortable existence and development. Soon, the family welcomed 2 more boys, Brent and Pierce, who became Kristen's younger brothers. However, the parents paid special attention to the upbringing and education of their eldest daughter. From an early age, Constance, the girl's mother, took it upon herself to unlock Kristen's potential. She enrolled her in ballet and modeling classes, hoping that these fields would open up a brilliant future for the child. And it must be said, not for nothing, as Kristen showed remarkable talent in both areas. Often, parents project their own ambitions and unrealized dreams onto their children. Sometimes this can lead to negative consequences, as the child doesn't always share the adult's vision of their life path. But for now, Kristen enthusiastically immersed herself in the world of dance and the catwalk. It seemed that a dizzying career full of bright prospects awaited her. Nothing foreshadowed trouble until one day a tragedy occurred that forever changed the girl's fate. In my opinion, the parents should have listened more to Kristen's own desires instead of imposing their vision of the future on her. However, who knew that an innocent childhood hobby would turn into such a dramatic twist in the life of this family? Just yesterday, Kristen was a rising ballet star, and today her future in this field is under threat. My colleagues managed to find out that dancing became not just a hobby or a whim of her parents for the girl, but a true calling. She lived and breathed ballet, despite her young age. Kristen was, without a doubt, an incredibly talented child. Her plasticity, grace, and artistry captivated the audience during each performance. The girl easily outshone professional dancers, demonstrating remarkable potential. Critics had already begun to compare her with leading ballerinas of our time, and producers predicted a brilliant career on the most prestigious stages of the world. These predictions seemed quite realistic, as Kristen was developing at an incredible pace. If everything had continued like this, she would have undoubtedly become a prima ballerina in one of the leading theaters in Europe or Russia. But life sometimes throws unexpected surprises, and they are not always pleasant. One such unpleasant surprise was a serious injury that Kristen received during training. A torn ligament in the ankle. It would seem a trifle because a child's body usually regenerates quickly. But the doctors were relentless. The damage was so significant that it would be impossible to return to the previous form. For the girl, this meant the collapse of all her dreams and hopes. As a detective, I perfectly understand that such situations can break anyone, not to mention a young, fragile girl. Losing the meaning of life at such an age is a real tragedy. But Kristen had to come to terms with the idea that her stellar ballet career had ended before it even began. But what happened next shocked me. Kristen, who only yesterday was full of hopes and dreams, now found herself at the bottom of despair. Her heart was broken, and her soul was drowning in an abyss of sorrow. Instead of enjoying her youth and planning for the future, the girl plunged into depression. And this is not surprising because she lost not just her favorite thing, but the meaning of life. But instead of fighting her demons, Kristen chose the easiest path and escape from reality. Before she even had time to finish school properly, she fell into the grip of alcohol and drugs. For her parents, this came as a real shock. They had no idea that their talented daughter could stoop to such a thing. Suddenly, it turned out that Kristen was not only using prohibited substances, but also spending the money her parents gave her for pocket expenses on them. The family began to have constant quarrels and conflicts. The tension grew every day until the situation got out of control. It got to the point where the police had to be called to calm the passions. It's hard to even imagine what the Forasovs had to go through in those days.
Just yesterday, they were proud of their daughter and made plans for her brilliant future. And today they found themselves at the epicenter of a family drama. However, despite the pain and disappointment, they did not turn away from Kristen. The parents continued to support her, hoping that these were only temporary difficulties. And indeed, after a few months, the situation began to stabilize gradually. Kristen was still suffering from depression and cravings for psychoactive substances, but at least she was no longer throwing tantrums or running away from home. It seemed that the worst was over, and now the family could overcome this crisis together. In my opinion, this case clearly demonstrates how fragile the human psyche can be. It is worth only one detail to fail, and the whole structure begins to fall apart before our eyes. And if it weren't for the support of loved ones, who knows how it would have ended for Kristen. But new trials awaited her ahead, which were to finally temper her character. But not everything is so good, because what was next struck me. 1994 became a year of new beginnings and hopes for Kristen. She finally pulled herself together and decided to start life from scratch. The girl realized that she could not endlessly feel sorry for herself and cry over a lost dream. If a ballet career no longer shines for her, then she can always try to realize herself in another field. Kristen decides to enter university to obtain higher education in a new profession. For her, this was a bold step, because not so long ago, she did not see the point in life at all. But despite all her efforts, the ghosts of the past continue to haunt the girl. Her mental health, although improved compared to previous years, still remained fragile. In 1995, a relapse occurred that almost cost Kristen her life. Depression returned with renewed vigor, clouding the mind and paralyzing the will. The girl again found herself on the edge of the abyss, from where, it seemed, there was no return.
She was ready to take a fatal step in order to get rid of the suffering that was poisoning her existence once and for all. But fate decreed otherwise. The suicide attempt was unsuccessful, and Kristen was saved at the last moment. This incident became a kind of point of no return, after which the girl realized that she could no longer exist like this. She had to change something in her life in order not to go crazy completely. That's when Kristen makes a desperate decision to temporarily leave her family and go on a trip to another country. She gets on a plane and flies to the city of Texona, on the border of Mexico and the USA. Perhaps a change of scenery and new impressions will help her reboot her consciousness and find new meanings. In my opinion, this step was quite risky, given Kristen's unstable mental state. After all, it is unknown how she will behave in a foreign country, far from family and friends. But sometimes it is such radical decisions that help people get out of the deepest depressive states. I had to hold my breath from what happened next. Sometimes life throws us unexpected surprises in the most unexpected places. So Kristen, who went to Mexico in search of peace of mind, met her destiny there. Greg de Villiers, a 22-year-old guy traveling with his brothers, accidentally ended up in the same city as her. Their paths crossed, and a spark immediately flashed between the young people. Over the next few days, Kristen and Greg spent time together, enjoying each other's company. It seemed that they had known each other for an eternity, so harmoniously and effortlessly they communicated. It was true love at first sight, which grew and strengthened with every minute. Even when it was time to return home, the lovers did not want to part and agreed to meet again. Barely setting foot on American soil, Kristen and Greg began to actively build their relationship. They constantly met, spent every free minute together, and soon realized that they could not live without each other. That's when Kristen agreed to move in with Greg. At that time, the young man was renting an apartment with his brother and a friend. But love is able to overcome any inconvenience, so Kristen agreed to such cohabitation without hesitation. But before deciding on this step, she decided to be as frank as possible with her chosen one. The girl told him about her mental health problems, about prolonged depression, and about the struggle with addiction, which was still ongoing. Greg was not at all frightened by this confession. He knew perfectly well that the abuse of psychoactive substances could destroy not only Kristen's health, but also their relationship. But the guy was firmly determined to support his beloved in this difficult struggle. His feelings were so strong and sincere that he was ready to make any sacrifices for the sake of their common future. From the point of view of a detective, I can only approve of Greg's position. Unfortunately, in my practice, I have often encountered cases where lovers turned away from each other at the first difficulties. And here is a young guy who has barely graduated from university, showing remarkable maturity and wisdom. As often happens, the black streak in Kristen's life was not limited to just one problem. The girl had barely begun to settle in a new place when things began to disappear in Greg's apartment. Today it's some kind of jewelry, tomorrow it's cash, and then checks. Of course, everyone immediately began to suspect the new inhabitant, because before her appearance, such incidents did not happen. But Kristen categorically denied her involvement in these thefts. She assured that she didn't even think about anything like that. The girl sincerely believed that she had managed to convince her roommates of her innocence when suddenly the incredible happened: the missing items were found in her purse. This incident came as a real shock to all the residents of the apartment. One of Greg's brothers even decided to move out, as he could no longer trust Kristen. He was convinced that the girl had deceived them by pretending to be an innocent sheep, but in fact, she simply took advantage of their gullibility. But Greg was in no hurry to condemn his beloved. He knew perfectly well that addiction can push a person to the worst deeds. Theft, deception, manipulation, all these are just side effects of the disease that Kristen was trying to fight. And although the fact of her guilt was obvious, Greg was not going to turn away from the girl. In my opinion, this situation clearly demonstrates the true essence of love. After all, it would have been so easy for Greg to wave his hand at a troubled girl and find himself another life partner. However, he decided not to give up and continue to take care of Kristen, helping her fight addiction. This required a lot of patience, wisdom, and strength of mind because a long and thorny path awaited them. Everything would be fine, but after the following events, I had to sit down. They say that true love can work miracles, and the story of Kristen and Greg is a vivid confirmation of this. Despite all the hardships and trials, the young man never once turned away from his chosen one. Day after day, week after week, he patiently helped her overcome the consequences of addiction, believing that the day would come when she would finally be able to return to a full life. And that day has come. Thanks to Greg's unconditional support and care, Kristen managed to achieve what seemed impossible just a few months ago: complete detoxification of the body. It was an incredible victory because the girl had to go through real hell, fighting her own demons. But her path to recovery did not end there. Kristen understood that she had to radically change her life in order to never return to the past again. She decides to enter the University of San Diego, where she begins to study diligently. The girl quickly becomes one of the best students in the course, demonstrating remarkable abilities and diligence. As a result, in 1998, Kristen received a diploma with honors. This achievement opens up new horizons for her, and the girl gets a job as a toxicologist at the Bureau of Forensic Medicine. Finally, she found her calling and can start life from scratch. It would seem that here it is long-awaited happiness. A stable job, a bright future ahead, and most importantly, a beloved man nearby. Greg, who went through all the trials with Kristen, decides to propose to her. He gets down on one knee and asks for her hand, dreaming of forever uniting his life with this amazing woman. From the point of view of a person who has seen a lot of broken destinies, I can only applaud Kristen and Greg. They prove that true feelings can overcome any difficulties. But will this be enough for a long and happy life? Rumor has it that on the eve of the wedding, the bride began to doubt her decision. Anxiety did not leave me, and not only me. Kristen, without hesitation, agrees to marry Greg, the man who was there for her during the most difficult moments of her life. It would seem that here it is the long-awaited happiness that one can only dream of. But fate decided to play a cruel joke on the young couple. A few weeks before the wedding, Kristen begins to be enveloped in doubts. The girl is seized by anxiety. She begins to panic, thinking about future married life. What if this decision turns out to be a mistake? Is she ready to take on such a responsibility? These and many other questions do not give Kristen peace day or night. In the end, she decides to turn to her parents for advice. Fortunately, loved ones find the right words to support their daughter. They assure her that doubts before the wedding are an absolutely normal phenomenon. Every bride experiences something similar because marriage is a serious step that changes your whole life. The main thing is to listen to your heart and not be afraid of the future. These wise instructions help Kristen calm down and believe in herself. And so, on June 5, 1999, the newlyweds finally step on the wedding towel. The ceremony is wonderful, the bride and groom are shining with happiness, and the guests sincerely rejoice for them. It seems that all fears and doubts are left behind, and only a bright and carefree life awaits the couple ahead. But as often happens, the euphoria from the wedding quickly passes, and grey weekdays come to replace it. A few months after the wedding, Kristen again begins to feel some strange anxiety. She confesses to her friends that she feels unhappy and depressed in her relationship with her husband. And then a new employee appears at work, Dr. Michael Robertson. This attractive Australian immediately attracts Kristen's attention. She begins to spend more and more time with him, discussing work issues. At least, this is how it looks from the outside. But my colleagues say that in fact, some special chemistry arose between these two. And very soon, the working relationship grew into something more. Well, from the point of view of an experienced detective, I can say that such situations happen more often than we would like. Sometimes people just can't resist temptation, especially when not everything is going well in their personal life. But in this case, the consequences of this reckless step will be simply fatal. The flirting between Kristen and Michael became so frank and undisguised that even the most naive and trusting colleagues began to suspect something. They constantly whispered, exchanged meaningful glances, and at the first opportunity remained alone. Some even saw this couple secluded in Michael's office during their lunch break, and although there was no direct evidence of a secret romance, all these little things added up to a rather eloquent picture. And indeed, the relationship between Kristen and Michael went far beyond business. They became so carried away with each other that they completely forgot about their marital duties. It seemed that they did not care about the feelings of their partners who were waiting for them at home. Love turned out to be stronger than common sense and a sense of duty. But the worst was yet to come. Having plunged headlong into this passionate romance, Kristen broke down again. All of Greg's efforts were in vain. His wife returned to her worst demon, drugs. And this time the temptation was greater than ever, because now she had direct access to prohibited substances right at her workplace. The forensic department stored various narcotic drugs seized from crime scenes. One of Kristen's direct duties was the accounting and control of these substances. That is, in fact, she could freely take whatever she wanted without fear of being exposed. and the girl took full advantage of this opportunity. From the point of view of professional ethics, such abuse of official position is unacceptable and even criminal. Any law enforcement officer is obliged to immediately report such an incident to their superiors. But Michael decided otherwise. Having learned about his beloved's problems, he not only did not condemn her, but also undertook to cover up Kristen's antics. In my opinion, this was a fatal step, and this untied her hands completely. Now her decline was only a matter of time, and nothing could stop this process. While Kristen and Michael enjoyed their secret romance, Greg, as always, remained in the dark. The poor guy sincerely believed in his wife's fidelity, not even suspecting that something was going on behind his back. He continued to swear eternal love to her, not noticing the obvious signs of betrayal. But in the end, the truth came out. One day, Greg accidentally came across a love letter written by Michael to Kristen. This scrap of paper, hidden in a woman's purse, became a real bomb that shattered their marriage to smithereens. The man was shocked and enraged at the same time. How could she do this after everything he had done for her? But what struck Greg the most was not even the marital infidelity. Much worse was the fact that because of her relationship with Michael, Kristen started using drugs again. All the efforts that Greg had made to pull her out of this swamp turned out to be in vain. His wife simply spat in his soul, destroying the last hope for a happy family life. Of course, Greg was not going to remain silent. In a fit of anger and indignation, he threatened to expose everything to Kristen's superiors. And this was not an empty threat. The man perfectly understood that for such antics, his wife and her lover could not only be fired from work, but also brought to criminal responsibility. However, that day the quarrel ended in nothing. The couple was simply tired of figuring out their relationship and decided to postpone this conversation until the morning. The next working day, Greg did not show up for work. His absence caused concern among the management, because the man had always been distinguished by punctuality and responsibility. An attempt to call him did not yield any results. The phone was hopelessly silent. At the same time, Kristen, as if nothing had happened, went to work. She even found time to chat with Michael, although she tried not to draw too much attention to it. Meanwhile, a real horror was waiting for her at home. Returning home for a lunch break, Kristen found her husband unconscious in bed. Greg was barely breathing, his body covered in cold sweat. The woman panicked and rushed to call an ambulance. The dispatcher on the other end of the line instructed her on how to properly perform artificial respiration and heart massage, but all attempts to bring her husband back to consciousness were in vain. When the medics arrived at the scene, a chilling picture opened up to their eyes: Greg's lifeless body lying on the bed, strewn with red rose petals. And next to it lay Kristen's open diary, open to the page where she mused about how she would leave her husband for a new life. These details immediately led the medics to certain reflections. At the hospital, Greg was officially declared dead. A shocked Kristen, through tears, told the police about her terrible day, not forgetting to mention the rose petals. They say it was a symbol of her and Greg's breakup. To be honest, it sounded too melodramatic, and Kristen's own behavior raised many questions. Did she really hope that her husband would simply let her go to another? However, the autopsy showed that Greg's death was due to an overdose of psychotropic substances, and this raised even more questions because the man had always been an opponent of drugs. Is all this just a tragic suicide or someone's insidious plan? But here is the brother of the deceased, Jerome, absolutely convinced that Kristen is behind all this, and it seems that he is determined to achieve justice at all costs and expose the deceitful daughter-in-law. At least, the man immediately began to act. He regularly called Kristen, recording all the conversations, and at the same time pressured the police, demanding a thorough investigation of the case. Jerome's persistence, the brother of the deceased Greg, was not in vain. Under his pressure, the investigators still returned to the investigation of the case, even though the initial version of suicide seemed quite plausible. And then one of the detectives notices an interesting detail: Greg's remains were sent for autopsy to the same department of forensic medicine where Kristen worked. It would seem that there is nothing strange because it is a standard procedure, but the person responsible for the autopsy turned out to be none other than Michael Robertson, the lover of the suspect. And this forced the investigation to look at this whole story from a different angle. Digging deeper, the detectives found out that just a few hours before her husband's death, Kristen had managed not only to give consent for the donation of his organs, but also to prepare everything necessary for the cremation of the body. Such efficiency in the actions of the grieving widow was difficult to write off as a coincidence, and the examination conducted by Robertson raised many questions. To avoid any doubts and manipulations, it was decided to conduct repeated toxicological tests in an independent laboratory in Los Angeles, and the results were shocking. They differed significantly from those obtained in San Diego. Yes, traces of psychoactive substances were indeed found in Greg's body, but one of the drugs exceeded the lethal dose by as much as 7 times. That is, this substance was fatally dangerous for a person in such an amount. Of course, a natural question immediately arises: why was a private laboratory able to detect this drug, and the forensic experts of San Diego did not? Did they simply not notice the obvious? Although, on the other hand, there is an explanation, because we are talking about a very rare and dangerous drug, tests for which are usually not prescribed in routine cases. But this does not remove other issues. As Kristen claims, her husband was alive and relatively healthy during the day, although he looked somewhat sluggish. So why did he drop dead in the evening from such a crazy dose of the drug? And why was fluid found in his lungs, indicating repeated loss of consciousness? How could a person in such a state lay out rose petals on the bed and then calmly go to sleep? Is a drug addict with such experience would keep at home any vial of his medicines? Even more questions arose after the interrogation of the ambulance crew. It turns out that the medics arrived at the call just 3 minutes after Kristen's call, and when they entered the bedroom, the woman for some reason was not near her husband's body, but in a completely different room. Paramedics also noted that Kristen was unlikely to have performed heart massage, at least for the last few minutes before their arrival, because there was no characteristic redness from chest compression on Greg's chest. The investigators also carefully studied the recording of the conversation between Kristen and the ambulance dispatcher on that fatal night, and they came to the conclusion that the tape does not contain sounds that usually accompany resuscitation procedures. Did the widow not try at all to save her dying husband, or did she simply lack the skill to simulate the provision of assistance? However, this is not the only thing that the detectives found out. Thanks to the testimony of one of the police officers who was at the scene and then accompanied the body to the hospital, it became known that on that night Kristen met with some man. They even hugged in front of the cop, and this mysterious guest turned out to be none other than Michael Robertson. So a search in the offices of both lovers was only a matter of time, and although Michael admitted that he covered up petty thefts of drugs by Kristen, which she used, he allegedly had nothing to do with the disappearance of other substances from the warehouse. However, trusting the words of a person who has just been fired for an official crime would be at least naive. One thing can be said for sure: the investigation of this case is far from over. Ahead, the investigators have a lot of work to do, because the evidence pointing to Kristen's involvement in her husband's death continues to accumulate, and an avalanche of compromising evidence is about to bury her head. The least of which are love messages found on the suspect's work computers, and most importantly, correspondence in which lovers directly discussed the same drug that became fatal for Greg. And as if that were not enough, there is information that Kristen and Michael at one time attended a special presentation dedicated to the properties and dangers of this substance. Did they just take an interest in the topic for work purposes? Or maybe they were thinking about something more sinister. No less strange are Kristen's actions on the day of Greg's death. When buying roses, she paid in cash for some reason, as if she wanted to hide this purchase. But the system still recorded the goods she selected, because the woman naively used her loyalty card. And what do we see? A red rose turned out to be a mandatory attribute of the posthumous installation. Coincidence? I do not think so. Meanwhile, Michael Robertson quietly left the S, going to look after his sick mother in Australia. A convenient legend, isn't it? Especially considering that in his homeland, American laws will not reach him. However, even from there, he will not be able to escape justice. After all, 7 months later, on June 25, 2001, Kristen Frost was officially charged with the murder of her husband. Despite all her assurances of innocence and appeals to the version of suicide, the jury found the woman guilty. And in my opinion, absolutely rightly, there was too much incontrovertible evidence collected against her. So the judge passed the only correct sentence: life imprisonment without the right to early release. Does this mean that the case is closed? Not at all. After all, there is one more person involved, Michael Robertson, who continues to hide abroad. However, sooner or later they will get him too. I would even say that it's only a matter of time, because an arrest warrant for the doctor has already been issued. American cops will just have to show a little more ingenuity and persistence to drag this scum to justice. This happened in a small town of Insuline, Michigan, with a population of just about 2,500 residents. In one of the houses located on a quiet street on the outskirts of town, a horrific crime took place.
The police struggled for a long time to piece together the numerous clues and leads they found at the scene. But unexpectedly, a witness appeared whose testimony helped shed light on this complex case. He clearly remembered the last words of the victim before death. This story is about how the persistence and professionalism of the police helped solve a brutal murder and achieve justice, despite what seemed to be a dead end in the investigation. Martin Durham, born in 1969, grew up in the town of Grand Rapids, Michigan, in a family with several children. His parents owned a house in the countryside, so Martin's childhood was spent in the picturesque surroundings of nature. Like many boys his age, he enjoyed fishing, hiking, and was fond of photography, trying to capture bright moments of life. Often together with his older cousin, they would take a tent, backpacks, and go on multi-day hikes, enjoying the fresh air and the beauty of the surrounding landscapes. Over the years, a strong friendship developed between them that lasted a lifetime. Martin met his first love at the age of 17. Her name was Glennon Johnson. She was a year older than him. The young people lived next door to each other and went to the same school. But their whirlwind romance did not last long, and soon they broke up. However, something elusive continued to draw them to each other, perhaps the memories of the brightness of first feelings. They got back together, but then broke up again, and this happened several times. Martin and Glennon had a lot in common, so despite the breakups, they constantly gravitated towards each other. Perhaps the reason was the similarity of interests and hobbies that made them kindred spirits. But at some point, they still decided to finally part ways and go their separate ways. A long time passed before the former lovers saw each other and talked again. During this time, another girl appeared in Martin's life, to whom he immediately felt a liking. It was Christine Keller. The spark very quickly ignited between them, and soon they began living together. After just a few months, Martin realized that Christine was the one with whom he wanted to link his life. In 1989, the couple got married. The parents gave the newlyweds a separate house in a residential area of the city where they moved. Over the next few years, they had 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter. Christine devoted herself to housekeeping and raising the kids, while Martin took on the responsibility of providing for the family. He not only worked as an auto mechanic, but also for many years moonlighted at a local restaurant. The income was quite decent, and the family had enough to live on. However, the first years of family life turned out to be difficult, especially considering that all 3 children were born one after the other. The shoulders of the young parents were burdened with a lot of worries and cares associated with caring for the babies. Constant lack of sleep and fatigue made themselves felt, because of which the couple began to quarrel more and more often. But they did not give up and were full of determination to cope with all the difficulties. Martin proved to be a caring and loving father who tried with all his might to provide a decent life for his family. To many, he seemed like an exemplary family man. But unfortunately, even Martin's attitude towards his family did not protect him from the tragic events that happened in 1995. One day, a truck whose driver ignored a red traffic light crashed into Martin's car at full speed. The damaged car dragged the passenger car along with the driver for several dozen meters, after which it finally stopped. As a result of this terrible accident, Martin received serious injuries, multiple fractures, including ribs, jaw and legs, as well as a severe traumatic brain injury. A significant area of the brain was damaged. The best doctors fought for Martin's life, but despite all their efforts, he fell into a coma in which he remained for several months. During this time, he had to undergo several complex surgeries. Surviving was a miracle, and ahead of him was a long and difficult recovery period. Even such seemingly elementary things as the ability to sit or hold his head, Martin had to relearn from scratch. He actually had to learn to control his body anew. In addition, his face was disfigured, and some brain functions were irretrievably lost. But despite all this, Martin did not give up. He continued to fight to return to normal life and be with his family again. At first, the man could not do without a wheelchair at all. Then for a long time he moved on crutches. Gradually, his health improved, but only physically. Psychologically, Martin was broken. He realized that he would no longer be able to work as a mechanic and support his family as before. And now his capabilities were severely limited due to the injuries he sustained. All this turned his former life upside down. The most painful thing for Martin was the realization that he would no longer be able to lead the active lifestyle he was used to. Previously, he loved spending time in nature, going hiking, fishing, and now he was forced to stay at home around the clock, and sometimes even be bedridden. Every movement was given with incredible difficulty and was accompanied by severe pain,
which could only be dulled by the most powerful painkillers. And judging by the doctor's predictions, Martin would have to put up with these consequences of the accident for the rest of his days. But it was not only the victim himself who suffered from this situation, but also his loved ones. It was especially difficult for his wife Christine, who had previously been engaged only in household chores and raising children, and now she was forced to urgently look for a job and arrange for the kids to go to kindergarten in order to somehow make ends meet and provide for the family. She also had to take care of her disabled husband. It's good that relatives came to the rescue, thanks to whose support Christine was able to cope with the trials that fell on her. But as it turned out, financial difficulties were not the only problem. According to Christine, Martin became irritable, often snapped at her, showing incomprehensible aggression and hostility. In addition, due to a brain injury, he began to have memory problems. The man forgot not only some long-standing events, but also what had been happening to him and his family in recent years. It happened that he could not remember the names of his children, and many friends with whom Martin had been close for decades, he now perceived as completely unfamiliar people. All this led to the fact that Martin began to withdraw into himself more and more and move away from others. He simply could not maintain normal communication due to constant confusion in his head, memory problems, and lack of concentration. The man became alienated and indifferent to everything. He spent most of his time alone with his thoughts, which he did not share with anyone. At the same time, Martin continued the course of treatment and rehabilitation. He regularly attended physiotherapy procedures. From time to time, he was admitted to the hospital for another examination. During this period, he had to change several doctors, and finally, the first positive results began to appear. Martin's physical condition improved significantly, although the psychological consequences of what he had experienced still made themselves felt. Christine recalled this difficult period of their life with sadness and pain. She understood how hard it must be for her husband. After all, he had always been so punctual and pedantic before, especially when it came to finances, and now he could not even count his own money. At the same time, Martin constantly controlled and criticized his wife's expenses, which only increased the tension in their relationship. The young family was going through really hard times. Its head had to fight every day not only with physical pain and the consequences of injuries, but also with psychological problems. The inability to cope with some of them made Martin irritable and angry. He snapped at Christine for any reason, although she did not deserve it at all. For some time, Christine tried to treat this with understanding. She realized that it was very difficult for Martin now, and tried to accept all these changes in his character. But nothing lasts forever, and one day her patience ran out. 2 years after the ill-fated accident, she filed for divorce. Later, the woman admitted that she took this step not out of good life, but simply because Martin had become completely unbearable. For the man, this was another blow. For a long time, he felt resentment and bitterness over Christine's decision to leave him. The ex-wife took the children and moved out of their shared home, while Martin remained under the supervision of his parents, who visited him regularly. But life did not end there. It was necessary to move on, and Martin did not even think to stop and give up. The man received a decent insurance payout, which he decided to invest in real estate. He bought a new house in another area. In addition, throughout the recovery period, Martin received a monthly monetary compensation for the accident. This allowed him to stay afloat and provide for his existence. Martin moved into his new home not alone, but with a parrot that remained from his former family life. Christine loved this bird very much, but decided to leave it to her ex-husband so that he would not be so lonely. The parrot was already quite old, but became a real joy and moral support for Martin in his new place. The only consolation for Martin in his new life was his faithful feathered friend, a 15-year-old African grey parrot named Bud. It was in this unusual company that the man settled in a house located in the Sand Lake area, about 36 kilometers from his former home. Martin was determined to regain his strength as soon as possible, get back on his feet and start living a full life, primarily for the sake of his children. He settled in and adapted quite quickly in his new place. Despite the divorce, the man continued to maintain close ties with his sons and daughter, communicating with them regularly. Moreover, he even managed to establish quite friendly relations with his ex-wife. She noted that Martin had some inner core and a clear goal to get back on his feet as soon as possible and return to normal life. Behind the house, Martin laid out a small garden and enjoyed arranging it. It turned out that the man had a real talent for landscape design and gardening. The neighbors quickly appreciated his abilities in this area and began to turn to him more and more often with a request to help them arrange their plots and take care of the lawn. In fact, this became an additional source of income for Martin, and most importantly, it restored his sense of self-worth and faith that he was able to overcome any difficulties. All this had a beneficial effect on Martin's condition. During this period, doctors recorded a stable, positive trend in him. Of course, the recovery was not as fast as we would like, but progress was obvious. However, despite the clear improvements in Martin's well-being and morale, his ex-wife was in no hurry to return to him. Christine was afraid that after calming down and believing in the irreversibility of the changes, Martin would again begin to demonstrate the negative sides of his personality, as it happened more than once before. Therefore, she decided to limit herself to only moral support for now. She met with her ex-husband, brought the children to visit him, but no more than that. But in 1997, Glenna Johnson, Martin's first love, suddenly reappeared on his horizon. By a twist of fate, she had also recently divorced her husband. The old acquaintances renewed their communication, which very quickly grew into something more. Old feelings flared up with renewed vigor. Glenna visited Martin more and more often, and soon moved in with him altogether. Her children from her first marriage stayed with their father, but the woman regularly took them to her place. Sometimes Martin's children also visited them. At moments when this large and noisy company gathered together, life in the house was full of dynamics. But for the most part, Martin and Glenna spent time alone. On quiet and peaceful days, the couple enjoyed their usual activities. They went fishing, hunting, and took walks together. As much as possible, Glenna tried to adapt to Martin's physical capabilities so that he could participate in all these activities. But of course, this was very difficult for him, so for the most part, they limited themselves to unhurried walks around the neighborhood or trips to the local casino. They were drawn there in memory of their cheerful and carefree youth. Over time, visits to this establishment became something like a traditional ritual for the couple. Every month they came here to try their luck and have fun. Glenna and Martin quickly became familiar faces in the local community. They often gathered numerous friends and acquaintances at their home, played poker with them, and cooked barbecue in the backyard. From the outside, they looked like a surprisingly harmonious and happy couple. Friends and acquaintances were convinced that Martin and Glenna had finally found each other after many years of wandering and were now enjoying their well-deserved happiness. So much so that they were not even too surprised when in the summer of 2005 the couple decided to officially formalize their relationship. However, some particularly close friends knew that behind the illusory facade of well-being hid a completely different reality. As you know, after the accident he survived, Martin changed a lot, and not for the better. He became harsh, demanding, and too controlling. Because of this, the couple often had conflicts. Martin tried in every possible way to limit Glenna's freedom. He did not like it when she spent time without him or did some things on her own. Among other things, he sought to completely control the finances and the distribution of money in the family, which also did not add harmony to their relationship. Glenna tried to maintain independence, at least in running the household, but even here there were no complaints from her husband. He constantly suspected her of hiding some expenses from him or spending too much money on unnecessary things. At that time, Martin continued to live on disability benefits, and his wife received payments as his guardian. But she had one ruinous hobby. She loved gambling and could lose a lot of money at the casino. In addition, the woman often visited there without her husband's knowledge, although she was a regular at this establishment. As a result, debts that only grew. Another area of constant tension in Martin and Glenna's relationship was his communication with his ex-wife, Christine. Obviously, he did not tire of complaining to his new chosen one about how the former abandoned him at the mercy of fate in the difficult period immediately after the accident, while not taking into account that he himself made Christine's life truly unbearable. Martin's ex-wife endured his antics for 2 whole years, but at some point she could not stand it and left him. However, she did not completely turn away from her husband, but tried to support him as best she could. She continued to communicate with him, brought the children to visit. Interestingly, at the same time, Martin apparently considered it possible to complain to Christine about his new wife, and not in the best terms, and his discontent gradually passed on to Glenna herself. There is information that she also did not hesitate in expressions when talking about the children of her husband from his first marriage. Of course, they told their mother everything, and in the end they refused to go to their father if his new chosen one was present there. They did not want to listen to unpleasant things about their own mother again and again. It is clear that Christine supported the children in this and stopped visits to her ex-husband. This situation could not but irritate Martin, so he snapped at Christine and constantly conflicted with her. All this affected his relationship with Glenna, which also became more and more tense. That is, family relationships at this stage were specifically upset, and by their behavior, all participants in this love triangle only aggravated the situation. By the way, there is one interesting detail that very eloquently testifies to the sincerity of Glenna's feelings for Martin, at least in the past. It turns out that on the back of her palm she had his name tattooed, which she made 18 years ago, during their first romance. And during all this time, she never removed the tattoo, apparently hoping to someday resume the relationship. It turns out that for all 15 years while Martin was married to another, Glenna continued to love him and wait. But despite such dedication from Glenna, little in the couple's current relationship resembled romance. Particularly often, conflicts arose between them over money, all because of Martin's suspicions that his wife was spending much more than she earned, because of which he constantly accumulated debts. To somehow plug holes in the budget, she periodically borrowed money from her husband, naturally, without his knowledge. Gradually, Glenna took complete control of the family finances, which only worsened the situation. The woman even began to appropriate checks from the insurance company that came in Martin's name every month. And also, according to available information, she secretly sold the painkillers that he took on doctor's orders. We are talking about potent drugs, the release of which is strictly regulated. It seems that Martin himself did not use them regularly, so considerable stocks accumulated in the house. Glenna took advantage of this by selling the drugs on the side. However, it is still not clear to what extent Martin was aware of this and whether he approved of such activities. There are different points of view on this matter. Some argue that the man himself was engaged in this dubious business since he began to recover from the accident, supposedly in order to compensate for the lack of income due to the absence of a permanent job. Others tend to believe that it was Glenna who, without her husband's knowledge, appropriated the remnants of the drugs and sold them, taking advantage of his forgetfulness due to injury. Be that as it may, but despite all these undercurrents, the unhealthy relationship in the couple lasted for over 11 years. By 2015, Martin and Glenna were still pretending to be a friendly couple, although they especially did not hide that the marriage was cracking at the seams. Quarrels broke out more and more often, and sometimes they were really serious. One of the couple's friends said that he even once witnessed an altercation during which Glenna threatened Martin with murder. Although it must be admitted that still most of the time they diligently played the roles of happy newlyweds, walking hand in hand, as at the very beginning of the relationship many years ago. However, in May 2015, the issue of divorce seems to have come to a head. One day at the beginning of the month, Christine suddenly learned that Martin was selling the house. She accidentally came across a corresponding announcement on an auction site and was terribly surprised by this. She immediately called her ex-husband to find out what was happening. In the conversation, she wondered why on earth he had decided to get rid of his beloved home, in the arrangement of which he had invested so much effort and soul. Martin was stunned by this news because he was not planning anything of the sort. He asked Glenna and heard that, most likely, some mistake had occurred and that she would certainly figure it out. But as far as we know, the wife never returned to this topic again, and the announcement meanwhile did not disappear. By the way, shortly before this, the couple had already had their car confiscated due to overdue loan payments. Then Glenna also convinced her husband that it was a misunderstanding and that she would quickly resolve the problem. But as we see, nothing changed as a result. The auction for the sale of the house was to take place literally in 3 weeks. Most likely, the reason for such an unexpected decision was Glenna's numerous debts, which she managed to accumulate over the years of marriage with Martin. Money was urgently needed, so the woman obviously planned to gain it from the sale of the house and thereby pay off the creditors. But she preferred not to tell her husband about it. She probably understood that he was unlikely to approve of such an initiative. Therefore, she acted secretly. And so on the morning of May 13, 2015, an incident occurred that later turned out to be fatal. One of Martin's neighbors came to his house around 8 a.m., intending to discuss some household issues. To the man's surprise, no one opened the door for him, although usually at this time the owner was already awake and going about his business pottering in the garage or in the garden. Moreover, Martin's car was parked near the house, so he clearly hadn't gone anywhere. It was also strange that Glenna, who also usually woke up early and was busy with household chores, did not respond. The neighbor nervously walked around the house, but in vain. Everywhere was quiet, and the garage was generally locked from the inside. However, the front door was open. The man entered the house, called out to the owners, but again silence in response. A little confused, he went to the couple's bedroom and froze on the threshold, struck by a terrible sight. Right in the middle of the room, Martin lay in a pool of blood, and next to him was his wife Glenna with a gunshot wound to the head. Frightened to death, the neighbor immediately ran out, assuming that an armed criminal might be hiding somewhere in the house. With trembling hands, he dialed 911 and called the police. When the ambulance staff arrived at the scene, they only threw up their hands. It was already impossible to help 46-year-old Martin. He was lying in bed in his underwear and, judging by the temperature of the body, had been dead for several hours. But his 47-year-old wife, although unconscious from blood loss, was still breathing. The woman was mumbling something incoherently, but the paramedics could not make out what exactly. Unlike Martin, she was fully clothed. Glenna was urgently taken to the hospital, where she was provided with the necessary medical assistance. In parallel, detectives arrived at the scene and began their investigation. As it turned out during the examination, both victims received numerous gunshot wounds. A total of 6 shots were fired, of which 5 were fatal for Martin, who died instantly. But his wife, one might say, was lucky she got off with only 1 shot through the skull, although the trajectory of the bullet's flight touched the brain, but not critically. Therefore, after the operation, the woman quite quickly began to recover, and after a few days she was ready to give testimony to the police, who were just eager to start interrogating her. In the meantime, the detectives limited themselves to a thorough examination of the crime scene, and a lot of what they saw frankly surprised and even alarmed them. In particular, they noticed that the picture clearly did not resemble the consequences of an ordinary robbery. After all, absolutely nothing of value disappeared from the house, including the couple's wallets and other personal belongings. Even the money lying in plain sight was for some reason not touched by the criminal. Even more alertness was caused by the fact that the attacker got into the house without any signs of breaking in. The front door was open, and the bars on the windows were intact. So, did Martin or his wife let the killer in themselves? If so, did they know him? Very strange. However, soon the investigators had another version. The reason for the attack could well have been a conflict over the Durham's dealings with the sale of prescription drugs. The police found out almost immediately that Martin and Glenna were doing something like this. It only remained to find out all the details of this scheme, who, to whom, what and in what volumes was selling. The detectives suggested that during one of these operations something went wrong, and a fight broke out between the couple and their clients, which ended in a shootout. To confirm or refute this hypothesis, criminologists sent all the material evidence found at the scene for examination, including weapons and cartridge cases, and the results were stunning. Firstly, the pistol from which both victims were shot belonged to Martin himself. He had kept it for many years, which completely ruled out the version with an outside attacker. Secondly, the location of blood traces and other biological fluids indicated that the main events unfolded not at all in the bedroom, where the bodies were found, but in the living room. There were a lot of splashes and streaks on the floor. In addition, judging by the shell casing found, at least 1 shot was fired in this very room. It turned out that first the shooting took place in the living room, but for some reason then it was decided to continue it in the bedroom, after moving one or both victims there. Why was it necessary to do this? The investigators had a growing feeling that someone had tried very hard to stage the crime scene, and deliberately clumsily, as if trying to confuse the traces, but doing it ineptly. Based on the results of examinations and additional examinations of the house, law enforcement officers came to an unexpected conclusion altogether. Namely, all the shots at Martin were fired exclusively in the bedroom, and his blood in the living room is for some reason absent, as there are no traces of dragging the body. Instead, there was a lot of blood that belonged to Glenna. It was she who was hit by the bullet, the shell of which was found in the same room. Strange, isn't it? The woman was shot in one room and found in a completely different one. How is this possible? Is it really possible that after being wounded in the head, she had the strength to independently climb to the 2nd floor and get to the bedroom? Forensic experts believe that this is so because the woman's injury turned out to be not as serious as it seemed at first glance, especially since Glenna, when she was found, was conscious. And yet this discrepancy made the detectives wonder, could Martin's wife herself actually be involved in his death? Perhaps she first shot her husband and then tried to settle scores with life, staging everything as if a robber had attacked the couple. the alleged suicide attempt in this case was only a disguise. Of course, such bold assumptions required weighty evidence. It was not yet possible to interrogate Glenna. The woman was still in the hospital. But it was possible, for example, to study her phone. This is what they did, and the results exceeded all expectations. It turned out that shortly before the tragedy, Glenna was actively searching the internet for information about the Ruger pistol, from which her husband was shot and she herself was wounded. She seemed to be interested in how to use it. Another important detail is that the woman Googled ways to identify counterfeit banknotes, and just a few hours before shots rang out in the house, she called her bank several times and was interested in the state of the account. Such actions may indicate some serious financial problems that pushed Glenna to extremes. This guess was brilliantly confirmed when 2 suicide notes written by Glenna were found at the crime scene. In one note, she apologized to her children, and in the other, she said goodbye to all her relatives and friends. It followed from these lines that the woman really intended to end her life. Unfortunately, one important piece of evidence that could link Glenna to Martin's death was missing. Experts did not find her fingerprints on the murder weapon. However, there were none at all. The gun was carefully wiped by someone. Perhaps Glenna herself after the shot. Strange, but not excluded. Having compared all the available evidence and facts, the detectives restored the probable course of events that morning. In their opinion, Glenna, driven into a corner by debts and financial problems, decided to settle scores with life. But before that, for some reason, she shot Martin probably in the bedroom, after which she went down to the living room and shot herself in the head there. However, she did not manage to die immediately, like her husband, so she reached their shared bed, where she was later found. Of course, the police were eager to talk to Glenna and ask her all these uncomfortable questions. Therefore, they were just waiting for the moment when the doctors would allow it. In the meantime, the investigators continued to collect evidence and strengthen the evidence base against the likely suspect. But the victim's relatives almost had no doubt that Martin was killed by his own wife. Martin's ex-wife, Christine Keller, was especially convinced of this. As they say, a woman sees right through a woman. Although this news came as a shock to her, she could not even imagine that Glenna was capable of such a terrible deed. However, she never liked Christine because of her extremely difficult and conflicted nature. The only thing that worried the widow now, apart from the death of her ex-husband, was the fate of their shared parrot. After everything that happened, the woman took the bird to her home, where he would now live with her children. And about a week later, detectives finally visited Glenna in the ward. The doctors gave the go-ahead for interrogation. By that time, she was already feeling well, had undergone all the necessary operations and was conscious. According to the doctors, she was quite capable of giving adequate testimony. It remained only to listen to what she would tell. However, despite the optimistic assessment of the doctors regarding Glenna's condition, during the interrogation she suddenly stated that she did not remember anything at all about the events of that morning.
According to the woman, she never wrote any suicide notes and certainly did not plan to either kill Martin or lay hands on herself. Such total oblivion alarmed the police well. A person cannot remember absolutely nothing about such a horrible and traumatic incident, the center of which was herself. Moreover, Glenna time and again denied the very possibility of attacking her husband, but at the same time, as if deliberately emphasizing that she had no idea what had happened in their house a few days ago. You must admit, this is very strange and suspicious, and rather resembles a clumsy attempt to cover up traces and avoid responsibility. But well, the hands of the police were tied, because for an official accusation they did not yet have enough evidence. The investigation had to take a break, and only a few months later, when Glenna finally fully recovered and was discharged from the hospital, the department was able to resume this case. However, even in view of the new circumstances, the detectives understood that the evidence gathered was not enough. They were too indirect and ambiguous. This meant that there was a risk that the jury would not be convinced after all. Glenna could play on pity, pointing to her injury and complete memory loss. But it was at this moment that the unexpected happened. Assistance to the investigation was provided by the one from whom no one expected it at all. One night, Christine woke up from a strange noise on the first floor of the house. Suddenly, the parrot that had moved to her after the death of the owner started talking. The woman went downstairs and almost fainted from what she heard. The bird kept repeating the eerie phrase, "Please, Glenna, don't shoot." Moreover, he added these words exactly in the voice of Martin. Christine's hair literally stood on him from the realization of what she had just witnessed. Fortunately, she did not lose her head and was able to record this creepy monologue on the camera of her mobile phone.
Get your ass, get over
And as soon as the video was ready, the woman, without wasting a minute, called the police and told about the incident. A few hours later, the detectives were already viewing the unique evidence. Of course, the parrot could not testify in court, and the police understood that the jury might consider such a detail too strange or even comical. But personally, they had no more doubts left. Glenna shot Martin and tried to hide it. New details of this high-profile case instantly leaked to the press and caused a huge stir among journalists and the public. Meanwhile, the investigation was going its own way, and finally, in June 2016, the long-awaited breakthrough occurred on the basis of the collected evidence base. Glenna was officially charged with first-degree murder, after which the woman was arrested and placed in custody. According to the data obtained during numerous forensic and ballistic examinations, the police bit by bit restored the picture of what actually happened in the Durham house that fateful morning. Investigators were convinced that, provided they were presented competently in court, this information would not leave the jury any chance to acquit the defendant. The detectives finally had the opportunity to help the unfortunate Martin find justice even after death. The prosecutor argued that Glenna's act was the result of a deep financial crisis in which she found herself due to her passion for gambling. Debts grew like a snowball, and the woman hid it from her husband, paying for everything with new loans and forging documents. When the scheme began to burst at the seams, Glenna decided to end her life. As proof of this intention, 2 suicide notes were provided, one addressed to Martin, the other to the children. By the way, it is in them that the key lies to understanding why it was the criminal's husband who became her first and only victim. Obviously, something went wrong and Glenna's plans were prevented from being realized. According to the version of the investigation, the decisive role here was played by the plans for the sale of the house, which Martin learned about literally on the eve of the tragedy. Presumably, the quarrel broke out between the spouses, and in order to get rid of the main source of stress, Glenna shot her husband in a fit of rage, and only then she tried to end her life. The prosecutor insisted that there could be no other explanation, but the defense, of course, denied everything. Both Glenna herself and her lawyer unanimously claimed that the woman, due to a head injury, does not remember the events of that morning at all. They also talked about how much the defendant loved Martin, which means she was simply unable to harm him. To explain Glenna's strange behavior during previous interrogations, complete refusal to cooperate with the investigation and memory lapses, the lawyers provided a list of potent drugs that the woman was taking to restore cognitive functions. The defenders did not forget to mention the strange coincidence with the search queries about weapons in the defendant's phone on the eve of the tragedy, they say. Glenna used the same device exclusively for online games. The trial lasted 10 days. The prosecution was confident in its evidence base, but at some point it became obvious that the jurors were hesitating because the lion's share of the facts provided by the investigation was indirect in nature. That's when the prosecution decided on an unprecedented step to show the video with Martin's parrot. A loud sigh swept through the courtroom when a bird appeared on the big screen, repeating over and over in the voice of the deceased, "Please, Glenna, don't shoot." The impression was reinforced by the speeches of ornithologists and animal psychologists, who unanimously confirmed, yes, parrots are capable of accurate imitation, especially if they are strongly attached to the owner and spend a lot of time with him. And these birds are usually very sensitive to stress and are able to remember for many years something that made a great emotional impression on them. This unexpected demonstration seems to have played a key role in the fate of the defendant. Already after 8 hours of discussion, the jury returned a unanimous verdict. Glenna Durham was found guilty of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to life imprisonment without the right to parole. The 49-year-old woman was shocked by such a severe punishment and continued to deny her guilt. Until the end, she could not believe that the jury had bought into what she called the nonsense of some parrot. Even after being behind bars, Glenna never admitted her guilt. She is still there today. But the exposing bird, after the end of the process, lived for a long time in the house of Christine, the ex-wife of the murdered man, and her children. It is believed that it was the involuntary testimony of the parrot that helped preserve the memory of Martin and ultimately restore justice. And although this bird, of course, did not reveal any new details of the crime, his words became a strong emotional argument that made everyone look at this case from a different angle.